In the vast expanse of the Andromeda Coalition, where 12 alien species have united under one banner for over 3 millennia, there exists a simple truth that every sentient being knows. Humans are weak, fragile, and utterly insignificant. Their planet Earth was conquered not through military might, but through pity, a charity case for a species too primitive to survive on their own. But sometimes the most dangerous assumptions are the ones that blind you to the predator standing right beside you. Commander Zara Chen has spent 5 years proving herself in battles that would break the spirits of seasoned Krillian warriors. She has led impossible victories against the Void Swarm, saved entire colonies from annihilation, and earned medals that most aliens only dream of. Yet when she walks through the halls of Coalition Command, conversations stop not out of respect, but out of surprise that a pet human is allowed to wander freely without supervision. They see her small frame, her lack of natural armor, her dependence on technology just to breathe their air. What they don't see is the calculated fury behind her calm brown eyes, or the way her mind processes battlefield information faster than their most advanced tactical computers. They don't understand that humanity's greatest weapon was never their strength. It was their absolute refusal to accept defeat, even when defeat seems like the only logical option. The war against the Devourers is about to begin, and the Coalition is about to learn a lesson that will echo through the stars for generations to come. When you treat an apex predator like a harmless pet, you might just discover that the leash was never for their protection, it was for yours. Sometimes the smallest flame burns bright enough to ignite an entire galaxy, and sometimes the hero you've been waiting for has been standing invisible in your shadow all along. The emergency klaxon screaming through Coalition Command Station Omega 7 meant one thing: the Devourers had returned. Commander Zara Chen stood in the corridor watching as massive alien forms rushed past her like she was a piece of furniture. Krillian warriors, their crystalline exoskeletons catching the red emergency lights, thundered toward the command center without so much as glancing in her direction. A group of Veltar officials, their tentacled forms rippling with bioluminescent urgency patterns, flowed around her as if she were nothing more than a maintenance robot. She might as well have been invisible. 5 years of service, 5 years of leading the most successful tactical operations in the Coalition's recent history. 5 years of watching aliens who had never seen combat receive promotions while she remained locked at the rank of commander, despite recommendations from every superior officer she had ever served under. The brass always had the same excuse: humans were too fragile for the responsibilities of higher command, too emotional, too unpredictable, too primitive. Zara pressed herself against the wall as Admiral Thekvar, a massive Gornathi whose bulk could crush a hovercar, lumbered past without acknowledging her salute. She had saved his flagship during the Battle of Kepler Station, coordinating a defense that military analysts still called impossible. He had shaken her hand afterward, told her she showed surprising competence for her species, and promptly forgotten she existed. The story of her military career, her comm unit chirped with an incoming message. She expected another assignment to coordinate supply lines or analyze historical battle data, the sort of busy work they gave her to keep the pet human occupied while the real warriors handled actual threats. Instead, she found herself staring at orders that made no sense. Commander Chen, report to War Room Alpha immediately for strategic briefing. Priority Alpha 1, War Room Alpha, where they planned major military operations, where species survival decisions were made, where humans were decidedly not welcome. Zara read the message 3 times, certain it was a mistake. Then she noticed the authorization code. It came directly from Supreme Admiral Kex Thrall himself, the Draconian who commanded the entire Coalition Defense Force. She had met him exactly twice, both times in receiving lines where he had barely glanced at her before moving on to more important officers. She made her way through the station's corridors, her magnetic boots clicking against the metal deck plating in a rhythm that seemed impossibly loud compared to the silent gliding of the aliens around her. Coalition Command had been designed by and for species that averaged 3 times human size, so she navigated a world of oversized doors, towering ceilings, and furniture that required her to climb rather than sit. The war room's entrance loomed before her, a massive archway flanked by 2 Zentaran guards whose forearms held weapons that could vaporize a human with minimal effort. They looked down at her with the sort of expression she had learned to recognize, mild confusion mixed with annoyance, like finding a lost pet in a restricted area. "Commander Chen," she said, presenting her credentials, "I have orders to attend the strategic briefing." The guards exchanged glances that somehow conveyed an entire conversation. One of them activated a scanner that bathed her in blue light, confirming her identity and authorization. Their confusion deepened. "You are certain these orders are correct, human?" She had learned not to take offense at their casual dismissal of her name. To them, she was simply the human, as interchangeable as any other member of her species. The authorization comes from Supreme Admiral Kexthral himself. More exchanged glances, more confusion. Finally, with obvious reluctance, they activated the door. The war room opened before her like the mouth of some technological beast, and she stepped inside. The vast chamber fell silent. Every eye, optical sensor, and sensory organ in the room turned toward her. Admiral Thekvar looked like someone had just told him his ship was infested with parasites. General Mardun, a Scaran whose natural armor made him look like a living mountain, actually took a step backward as if her presence might be contagious. Even the holographic displays seemed to flicker with uncertainty. Supreme Admiral Kexthral stood at the center of the room, his reptilian features unreadable. He was ancient by Draconian standards, his scales bearing the ritual scars of 100 campaigns. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had spent centuries making decisions that affected the fate of entire civilizations. "Gentlemen," he said, using the Coalition standard term that technically applied to all species but somehow always sounded wrong when it included her, "we face an unprecedented threat. 3 hours ago, our deep space monitoring stations detected massive energy signatures along the outer rim. The Devourers have returned, and they are not alone." The holographic display activated, showing a 3D map of Coalition space. Red markers appeared along the frontier, each one representing a Devourer fleet. But these weren't the scattered raiding parties they had fought before. This was an armada. Intelligence estimates placed their numbers at over 10,000 vessels. Kexthral continued. They have consumed 17 star systems in the past 72 hours. At their current rate of expansion, they will reach our core worlds within 6 months. Admiral Thekvar's crystalline body resonated with a low, harmonic note that Zara had learned to recognize as extreme stress.
"Supreme Admiral, our combined fleets number barely 3,000 ships.
Even with our technological advantages, have proven insufficient," Kexthral interrupted. "The Devourers have adapted. They are using biomechanical ships that can repair themselves and evolve countermeasures to our weapons in real time. Traditional tactics are not merely inadequate, they are counterproductive." General Morden stepped forward, his massive frame casting shadows across the hollow display. "Then what do you propose? If conventional warfare cannot stop them, we need unconventional warfare," Kexthral said. His gaze moved deliberately around the room, touching on each of the assembled officers before finally settling on Zara. "We need tactics so unprecedented, so contrary to established military doctrine, that the Devourers cannot predict or adapt to them. We need someone who thinks in ways that our enemies cannot comprehend." The silence stretched until it became almost painful. Every alien in the room was staring at her now, and Zara could practically hear their thoughts. They were wondering why the pet human had been included in this briefing. They were questioning Kexthral's judgment. They were calculating how quickly they could escort her out without causing too much embarrassment. "Commander Chen," Kexthral said, his voice cutting through the silence like a plasma blade. "You have studied every major battle in Coalition history. You have analyzed our defeats as thoroughly as our victories. In your assessment, why do we continue to lose ground against the Devourers? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Around the room, she could see the barely concealed smirks and exchanged glances. They expected her to stumble, to prove once again that humans were out of their depth when it came to real warfare. This was entertainment to them, watching the primitive try to play with the adults. Zara looked at the holographic display, studying the red markers that represented the Devourer advance. She had indeed studied every battle, every tactical report, every after-action analysis. She had also studied something that apparently none of these career officers had bothered to examine: the Devourers themselves. Because we keep fighting them like they're us, she said. The smirks faded. Every tactical doctrine we employ is based on the assumption that our enemies think like we do, she continued, stepping closer to the holo display. We assume they value their own forces, that they have supply lines to protect, that they have strategic objectives beyond simple destruction. We fight them like they're rational actors pursuing logical goals. She manipulated the display, highlighting the pattern of Devourer attacks over the past 5 years. But they're not rational actors. They're a biological imperative, given technological form. They don't have supply lines because they consume everything they encounter and convert it to usable resources. They don't value individual ships because every vessel is expendable as long as the swarm continues to grow. They don't have strategic objectives because their only goal is consumption. Admiral Thekvar's harmonic resonance had shifted to a different frequency, confusion rather than stress. Commander, if your analysis is correct, then they are indeed unstoppable. How does one fight an enemy that cannot be reasoned with, cannot be deterred, and cannot be defeated through conventional means? You don't fight them, Zara said. You hunt them. The room erupted. Admiral Thekvar's crystalline body chimed with indignation. General Mordoon's scarred armor plates rattled as he shifted his weight. A dozen different voices began speaking at once, all expressing variations of the same theme. The human had finally revealed her fundamental ignorance of military reality. The silence, Kexthrall commanded, and the room fell quiet. Continue, Commander. Zara felt the weight of their attention, but for the first time in years, it didn't feel like dismissal. Kexthrall was actually listening to her. Every species in the Coalition approaches warfare from the perspective of civilization, she said. We fight to protect resources, territory, ideology. We assume our enemies share these motivations because they're the only ones that make sense to us. She gestured to the assembled officers. The Krillians excel at defensive warfare because they evolved on a world where resource scarcity made every stronghold precious. The Gornathi favor massive fleet engagements because their history is filled with empire-spanning conflicts over stellar trade routes. The Scarans use overwhelming force because their natural armor made them the apex predators of their homeworld. And humans, General Morden asked, his voice carrying a note of skeptical challenge. Humans, Zara said, evolved as persistence hunters. The confusion in the room was almost tangible. These were species that had conquered the stars, that had built an interstellar coalition spanning 12 different forms of life. The idea that they might have something to learn from a species that still struggled to breathe their air without artificial assistance was clearly beyond their comprehension. For most of human history, she continued, we were neither the strongest nor the fastest predators on our planet. We couldn't fly like the great birds, couldn't match the speed of the great cats, couldn't overpower the massive herbivores we needed to hunt for survival. So, we developed something else entirely. She manipulated the holodisplay again, showing the projected paths of devourer expansion. We learned to think like our prey. We learned to predict their movements, to anticipate their responses, to set traps that would work not just today but next week, next month, next season. We learned that the most effective way to take down something bigger and stronger than yourself isn't to fight it head-on. The display shifted, showing a complex web of projected fleet movements and supply routes. The Devourers aren't unbeatable. They're just hunting us the same way we hunt everything else, as if we're thinking, reasoning opponents who will respond to threats and opportunities in predictable ways. But what if we stopped responding predictably? Supreme Admiral Kexthrall leaned forward, his ancient eyes focused with an intensity that made several of the other officers shift uncomfortably. What exactly are you proposing, Commander? I'm proposing that we stop fighting a war, Zara said, and start conducting a hunt. I'm proposing that we use the one advantage we have that the Devourers can't counter. They don't understand what we actually are. She turned to face the room full of alien officers, most of whom were still looking at her like she had just suggested they surrender to the Devourers immediately. They see the Coalition as a unified military force because that's how we present ourselves. They adapt to our tactics because our tactics follow logical, predictable patterns based on our various species' evolutionary advantages. But they've never encountered humans in actual combat command positions because humans have never been given actual combat command positions, Admiral Thekvar said, his harmonic resonance now carrying a distinctly sardonic note. Exactly, Zara said, which means they have no idea what we're capable of when we stop pretending to be civilized. The silence that followed was different from the earlier confusion. This was the silence of beings who were beginning to realize that they might have made a fundamental error in judgment. Not about the war, about her. Supreme Admiral Kexthrall stood slowly, his massive form casting shadows across the entire room. When he spoke, his voice carried a gravity that made it clear he was about to make a decision that would change everything. Commander Chen, he said, you are hereby promoted to the rank of Admiral and granted full tactical authority over Operation Persistence Hunt. You will have access to any resources you require and the authority to command any forces you deem necessary. The room exploded again, but this time Kexthrall didn't call for silence. He simply waited as the other officers expressed their outrage, their disbelief, their certainty that this was either an elaborate joke or evidence that their Supreme Admiral had finally succumbed to the stresses of command. When the noise finally died down, he continued, You have 72 hours to present a detailed operational plan. If your theories prove correct, you will have saved the Coalition. If they prove incorrect, he paused, fixing her with a stare that could have melted armor plating. We will all die together, Admiral Chen. I trust you understand the weight of that responsibility. Zara felt something she hadn't experienced in 5 years of military service. The complete, undivided attention of superior officers who were actually waiting for her to speak. Not waiting for her to embarrass herself, not waiting for confirmation of their preconceptions about human limitations, but genuinely waiting to hear what she had to say. For the first time since joining the Coalition Defense Force, she wasn't invisible. I understand, Supreme Admiral, she said, and I promise you, the Devourers are about to learn why humans were the apex predators on a planet full of creatures that could kill us with their bare claws. As she left the war room, she could hear the explosive arguments beginning behind her. She had 72 hours to prove that 5 years of being treated like an irrelevant pet had actually been the perfect preparation for saving an entire galactic civilization. She had 72 hours to show them what happens when you finally take the leash off a persistence hunter. And she already knew exactly where to begin. The data archives deep within Coalition Command Station Omega 7 had never seen traffic like this. Admiral Zara Chen stood before a wall of holographic displays, each one streaming information that most officers would have found overwhelming. Battle reports, casualty statistics, fleet movements, technological analyses, psychological profiles of enemy forces, 5 years of accumulated intelligence about the Devourers flowing past her eyes at a rate that should have been impossible for any organic mind to process. But Zara wasn't just reading the data. She was hunting through it. Behind her, a small team of specialists worked frantically to keep up with her requests. Lieutenant Commander Vexara, a Veltar communications expert whose bioluminescent patterns had been flashing stress indicators for the past 8 hours, manipulated holographic controls with 4 of her tentacles while 2 others gestured helplessly at the flood of information. "Admiral," Vexara said, her translator rendering the musical tones of her native language into Coalition standard, "I must point out that you have been accessing classified materials for 14 hours without rest. Perhaps—" "I don't need rest," Zara said, not taking her eyes off the displays. "I need understanding. What are the devourers of the devourer behavioral patterns? But this time overlay it with the devourer behavioral patterns from the Kepler station attack." "But Admiral, those battles occurred 2 years apart." "The tactical situations were completely different. The tactical situations were different. The prey responses were identical." Zara gestured and the holographic display shifted to show both battles simultaneously. "Look at the pattern. In both cases, coalition forces established strong defensive positions and waited for the devourers to attack. In both cases, we inflicted heavy casualties but ultimately lost ground. Why?" Dr. Hemlock, the chief xenobiologist who had been summoned from his laboratory 6 hours earlier, clicked his mandibles in the Scaran equivalent of thoughtful consideration. His natural armor was scarred from decades of field research, and his reputation for understanding alien biology was unmatched in Coalition space. "The Devourer swarm demonstrated adaptive capability," he said, his gravelly voice carrying the certainty of someone who had spent years studying these creatures. "They modified their attack patterns based on our defensive measures." "No," Zara said firmly. "That's what everyone thinks happened, but look closer." She manipulated the display, slowing down the tactical recording until individual ship movements became clear. "Watch this section. Third wave, timestamp 1427. The hologram showed a group of Devourer vessels approaching a Coalition defensive line. As they came within weapons range, the alien ships suddenly dispersed, avoiding the kill zone exactly where Coalition forces expected them to appear." "Adaptive behavior," Dr. Hemlock confirmed. "They learned from the previous wave's casualties and modified their approach." "Wrong," Zara said. She rewound the sequence and played it again. "Look at the timing. The dispersal began before our weapons fired, before they had any new information to adapt to. This wasn't learning. It was instinct." Lieutenant Commander Vexara's patterns shifted to confusion. "Admiral, I don't understand the distinction." Zara turned away from the displays, and for the first time in hours, her team could see the intensity burning in her dark eyes. She looked like someone who had been awake for days, but also like someone who had finally found what they were looking for. "Adaptation implies conscious decision-making," she explained. "The creature encounters a threat, analyzes the situation, and chooses a different approach. That's what we do. That's what every civilized species does." She gestured back to the hologram. "But watch the timing again. Watch how every ship in the swarm changes course at exactly the same moment, with no communication lag, no command structure, no individual variation." Dr. Doc Stock Hemlock's mandibles clicked faster as understanding began to dawn. "Hive mind behavior. But our intelligence reports indicated—" "Our intelligence reports were based on the assumption that consciousness requires individual awareness," Zara interrupted. "But what if consciousness can exist at the swarm level without existing at the individual level? What if each devourer ship is more like a single neuron in a vast nervous system?" She manipulated the display again, showing the overall pattern of devourer movements across multiple star systems. When viewed from this perspective, the seemingly chaotic attacks resolved into something that looked disturbingly familiar. "It's foraging behavior," she continued. "Complex, sophisticated foraging behavior, but foraging nonetheless. They're not conducting military campaigns. They're feeding. And like any successful predator, they've evolved strategies to maximize their feeding efficiency while minimizing energy expenditure." The room fell silent, except for the soft humming of the holographic projectors. Her team stared at the displays with the dawning realization that they weren't looking at battle recordings. They were looking at nature documentaries. Lieutenant Commander Vexara's bioluminescent patterns had shifted to something Zara didn't recognize, a complex cascade of colors that the translator couldn't render into words. "Admiral," she said finally, "if your analysis is correct, then everything we thought we knew about fighting the Devourers is wrong." "Not wrong," Zara corrected. "Irrelevant. We've been trying to fight a war against an enemy that isn't at war with us. We're food to them. You don't declare war on your dinner." Hemlock moved closer to the displays, his scientific curiosity overriding his exhaustion. "But if they're operating on pure instinct, how do we combat that? How do you fight an enemy that isn't making conscious tactical decisions?" "The same way our ancestors fought every other predator on Earth," Zara said. "You don't fight the individual. You fight the behavior pattern." She called up a new set of displays, these showing Earth's biosphere and the complex predator-prey relationships that had shaped human evolution for millions of years. Images of great cats, pack-hunting wolves, and the early human tribes that had somehow survived and thrived despite being physically inferior to almost every other large predator on the planet. "Humans didn't survive because we were stronger or faster or more numerous," she explained. "We survived because we learned to think like the things that were trying to kill us. We learned to predict their behavior, to exploit their instincts, to turn their own evolutionary advantages against them." She gestured to a recording of a pack of wolves hunting caribou. "Look at this. The wolves are clearly superior to any individual caribou, stronger, faster, better armed. But the caribou survive because they understand the wolves' hunting pattern. They know when to run, when to fight, when to sacrifice one to save many. They've learned to think like wolves. But the Devourers are far more sophisticated than wolves," Dr. Hemlock protested. "Are they?" Zara asked. "Or have we just been assuming they are? Because sophistication is how we measure intelligence. What if the Devourers' greatest advantage isn't their technology or their numbers, but their simplicity? What if they're successful because they don't overthink things the way we do?" She brought up the tactical analysis of the most recent Devourer attacks, highlighting the patterns that had puzzled coalition strategists for years. "Every time we've tried to predict their movements using conventional military logic, we've been wrong. Every time we've assumed they would act in their own strategic interest, they've surprised us. But if you analyze their movements as foraging behavior, the display shifted, showing predicted movement patterns based on biological models rather than military ones. The accuracy was stunning, nearly 90% correlation with actual Devourer movements over the past 2 years. They're following optimal foraging theory," Zara continued. "They target systems with the highest energy return for the lowest energy investment. They avoid areas where they've faced significant resistance not because they're afraid of casualties, but because resistance indicates low food-to-effort ratios. They move in patterns that maximize their feeding efficiency across the entire swarm." Lieutenant Commander Vexara's patterns had stabilized into what Zara recognized as deep concentration. "Admiral, if you can predict their movements, does that mean you can counter them?" "Better than that," Zara said, a smile beginning to form for the first time in hours. "It means I can manipulate them. Foraging behavior can be modified through environmental changes. Change the environment and you change the behavior." Dr. Hemlock leaned forward, his massive frame casting shadows across the holographic displays. "What kind of environmental changes are you proposing?" Zara called up a star map showing the current Devourer advance and the Coalition's defensive positions. With quick gestures, she began marking specific systems, creating a pattern that looked less like a military formation and more like an elaborate snare. "We're going to make them think they're hunting us," she said, "while we're actually hurting them." The next several hours were a blur of tactical planning unlike anything the Coalition Defense Force had ever attempted. Instead of fortifying their strongest positions, Zara ordered them to appear vulnerable. Instead of massing their fleets for decisive battles, she scattered them across seemingly random systems. Instead of trying to deny the Devourers' resources, She began carefully poisoning those resources with subtle technological modifications that would be invisible until it was too late. "This is insane," Admiral Thekvar had declared when she presented the preliminary plan. "You're asking us to abandon every principle of military strategy. You want us to run from fights we could win? To leave entire systems apparently undefended? To waste resources on deception rather than preparing for battle? I'm asking you to trust that 5 years of being ignored has taught me something about being underestimated," Zara had replied. Now, as the final details of Operation Persistence Hunt came together, she found herself surrounded by officers who no longer looked at her like she was a pet human playing at being a soldier. They looked at her like she was something they didn't quite understand, something that might be far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The plan was elegant in its complexity and terrifying in its scope. Rather than meeting the Devourers in conventional battle, Coalition forces would appear to flee in panic, leaving behind what seemed like hastily abandoned systems rich with the technological resources the swarm needed to sustain its growth. But those resources would be carefully modified, infected with self-replicating programs that would spread through the Devourer network like a technological virus. More importantly, the pattern of abandoned systems would create what appeared to be an optimal feeding route, a corridor of rich targets that would naturally funnel the entire swarm toward a single destination. So, a destination where the Coalition would be waiting with every ship they had ever built, every weapon they had ever developed, and a trap that had taken the combined genius of 12 species to construct. "The beauty of it," Zara explained to Supreme Admiral Kex Thrall during their final briefing, "is that it doesn't require the Devourers to make any mistakes. It requires them to do exactly what they evolved to do, follow the path of least resistance toward the richest feeding ground. Their own instincts will deliver them to us." Kex Thrall studied the operational plan with the intensity of someone who understood that he was looking at either the salvation of the Coalition or its death warrant. "And if your analysis of their behavior is wrong, if they are capable of the kind of strategic thinking we've been assuming all along, then we'll find out in about 72 hours, Zara said. "But Supreme Admiral, I've spent 5 years studying every battle we've fought against them. I've analyzed every tactical report, every technological assessment, every xenobiological study, and in all that time, in all those encounters, the Devourers have never once done anything that couldn't be explained by sophisticated foraging behavior." She paused, looking out at the stars visible through the command center's massive viewport. Somewhere out there, an unstoppable swarm was consuming everything in its path, driven by instincts older than civilization itself. But instincts could be exploited. Instincts could be turned into weaknesses. "They think we're prey," she said quietly. "They have no idea what we actually are." Kex Thrall followed her gaze to the stars. "And what are we, Admiral Chen?" For the first time since receiving her promotion, Zara smiled with something that wasn't humor. It was the smile of a predator that had just caught the scent of its quarry. "We're the species that turned wolves into dogs," she said. "We're the species that made the entire planet our hunting ground. We're Persistence Hunters, Supreme Admiral, and the Devourers are about to learn what that means." As the final preparations began, as Coalition fleets moved to their positions and the most elaborate military deception in galactic history swung into motion, none of the alien officers who had spent years dismissing her as irrelevant could ignore the truth anymore. The invisible human was invisible no longer. The Kepler defense platform had been the pride of the Coalition Defense Force for over 2 decades. Its massive weapons arrays could sterilize entire fleets. Its shields could withstand direct hits from stellar phenomena, and its strategic position guarded one of the most important hyperspace routes in Coalition space. Now Admiral Zara Chen stood in its command center, watching her own forces systematically disable every system that made it a formidable defensive installation. "Admiral," Captain Zergath reported, his Gornathy bulk making the human-sized command chair look like a child's toy. "Demolition teams have completed their work. All primary weapon systems are offline and will appear to have suffered cascade failures. The platform will look like it was damaged in a desperate last stand." Zara nodded, not taking her eyes off the tactical display that showed the approaching devourer swarm. 3 weeks had passed since Operation Persistence Hunt began, and the deception was working perfectly. Too perfectly, according to some of the Coalition officers who still doubted her strategy. "Sensor phantoms are in place," reported Commander Vixine, a Veltar technician whose bioluminescent patterns had been cycling through anxiety indicators for hours. "When the Devourers arrive, they'll detect residual energy signatures consistent with a recent battle. Life support fluctuations will suggest survivors attempting to hide in the lower levels." "And our people?" Zara asked. "All essential personnel have been evacuated to the secondary positions," Captain Zergath confirmed. "Though I must say, Admiral, abandoning defensive positions of this value still feels wrong at a fundamental level." Zara understood his discomfort. Every instinct bred into Coalition officers over centuries of warfare demanded that they hold strong positions and force the enemy to come to them. What she was asking them to do violated every principle of military doctrine that had proven successful against conventional opponents. But the Devourers weren't conventional opponents. "Captain, show me the behavioral analysis from the Helix system evacuation," she ordered. The display shifted to show recordings from 2 weeks earlier when Coalition forces had staged their first panicked withdrawal from what appeared to be an indefensible position. The Devourer response had been exactly what Zara predicted. They had consumed the abandoned installations with methodical efficiency, but they had also exhibited clear behavioral patterns that proved her theory correct. "Watch the feeding sequence," she pointed to the hologram. "Notice how they prioritize targets. High-energy installations first, then technological resources, then raw materials. But look at the timing." Captain Zergath leaned forward, his massive frame creaking the deck plating. "They're following an optimal efficiency pattern. Maximum caloric return for minimum energy expenditure." "Exactly. And notice what they ignore." Zara highlighted several areas of the abandoned station that the Devourers had passed over entirely. Defensive installations that had been powered down, areas with no detectable energy signatures, anything that would require additional effort to access without providing immediate returns. Commander Vixine's patterns shifted to something that might have been understanding. They're not conducting military salvage operations. They're feeding. They take what's easiest to digest and move on. "Which is why this will work," Zara said, gesturing to their current position. The Kepler platform appears to be a wounded, partially defended installation with massive energy reserves and technological assets. To the Devourers, it's not a trap. It's a feast that's been conveniently prepared for them. The bridge fell silent except for the soft humming of the environmental systems. Around them, the platform's vast bulk stretched into darkness, its corridors and chambers now rigged with sensors and recording devices that would provide unprecedented data on Devourer feeding behavior. More importantly, those same corridors now contained something that no previous encounter had provided: a carefully designed technological infection waiting to spread throughout the enemy network. "Admiral," Captain Zergath said quietly, "what if they're more intelligent than you believe? What if this is the moment when they demonstrate strategic thinking rather than instinct?" It was the question that had been haunting Zara for weeks. Her entire strategy depended on the Devourers being sophisticated biological machines rather than truly conscious entities. If she was wrong, if they were capable of the kind of abstract reasoning that every other Coalition species took for granted, then Operation Persistence Hunt wasn't a brilliant tactical innovation. It was an elaborate form of suicide. "Then we die," she said simply. "But, Captain, I've spent 5 years being underestimated by every species in the Coalition. I know what it looks like when someone is pretending to be less intelligent than they actually are. The Devourers aren't pretending anything. They're doing exactly what millions of years of evolution programmed them to do." Her comm unit chimed with an incoming transmission from Admiral Thekfar, whose massive fleet was positioned 3 systems away, ready to begin the next phase of the operation. His crystalline features filled the screen. Admiral Chen, His voice carried the harmonic overtones that indicated extreme stress. Long-range sensors have detected the vanguard of the Devourer swarm. They will reach your position in approximately 6 hours. Are you certain you wish to proceed with this plan? Zara looked around the bridge at the officers who had volunteered to remain behind for the most dangerous phase of the operation. Not because they believed in her strategy. Most of them still thought she was insane. But because she had finally earned something that 5 years of invisible service had never provided: their respect. I'm certain, Admiral Thekvar. Begin Phase 2 of the withdrawal. Make it look convincing. Understood. And Admiral Chen? Thekvar paused, his harmonics shifting to frequencies she didn't recognize. For what it's worth, I hope you're right about this. The alternative is too terrible to contemplate. The transmission ended, leaving the bridge in tense silence. Outside the viewports, the stars wheeled slowly as the platform maintained its position at the edge of the hyperspace route. Somewhere beyond those stars, an unstoppable swarm was approaching, driven by hunger older than civilization. All personnel to final positions, Zara announced over the ship-wide comm. Remember, we're not here to fight them. We're here to learn how they think and to give them exactly what they expect to find. The next several hours passed with agonizing slowness. Reports filtered in from across the sector as coalition forces continued their carefully choreographed retreat, leaving behind installations that appeared hastily abandoned but were actually meticulously prepared. Each site contained the same technological bait that would soon be tested on the Kepler platform: self-replicating programs disguised as standard resource management systems. The beauty of the infection was its subtlety. Rather than attempting to damage Devourer systems directly, it would simply modify their efficiency algorithms by tiny amounts. A fraction of a % reduction in energy processing here, a slight delay in communications protocols there. Individually, the changes would be undetectable. Collectively, they would create the kind of systematic dysfunction that would leave the entire swarm vulnerable to conventional attack. But only if the Devourers actually were the sophisticated biological machines that Zara believed them to be. Admiral, Commander Vixine announced, her patterns now cycling through what Zara recognized as barely controlled terror. Sensors detect massive spatial distortions at the edge of the system. The swarm has arrived. The tactical display activated, showing dozens of energy signatures emerging from hyperspace. Then hundreds, then thousands. The Devourer swarm unfolded into real space like a vast, living constellation, each point of light representing a ship that could reduce a planet to its component atoms. Analysis confirmed swarm composition consistent with previous encounters, reported Lieutenant Morquette, a young Scaran whose natural armor was unmarked by combat experience. Biomechanical vessels, average length 2 kilometers, no detectable communication systems. Because they don't need communication systems, Zara murmured, watching the swarm begin to move toward the platform. They're not separate ships working together. They're organs in a single organism. The movement pattern was exactly what she had predicted. The swarm spread out in a formation that maximized sensor coverage while maintaining optimal feeding efficiency. No tactical considerations. No concern for potential ambushes. No apparent awareness that they might be walking into a trap. They were following their programming with the mechanical precision of a computer virus spreading through a network. They're beautiful, Commander Vixine whispered, her bioluminescent patterns shifting to something that might have been awe. Terrible, but beautiful. Zara had to admit there was something magnificent about watching the swarm approach. Each vessel moved with perfect coordination, part of a pattern so complex and elegant that it seemed almost choreographed. But that beauty masked something that every coalition species had failed to understand. This wasn't intelligence in any sense that they recognized. This was something far more ancient and, in many ways, far more dangerous. Admiral, Captain Zergath reported, the Vanguard has reached the outer sensor perimeter. They're conducting what appears to be a preliminary feeding assessment. The display showed smaller devourer vessels detaching from the main swarm, approaching the platform with movements that looked disturbingly like a predator testing the defenses of its prey. Energy beams swept across the installation's hull, analyzing its composition and determining the optimal consumption sequence. "All systems are reading as expected," Lieutenant Morquette announced. "Damaged but not destroyed. Significant energy reserves. Minimal defensive capability. We're presenting exactly the profile they're looking for." The test vessels withdrew, and for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, nothing happened. The swarm hung motionless in space, and Zara felt a cold fear begin to spread through her chest. What if they were smarter than she thought? What if they had recognized the trap? Then the feeding began. The main body of the swarm flowed toward the platform like a tide of living metal, and Zara watched with fascination as thousands of years of evolutionary programming played out before her eyes. They approached the installation from multiple vectors simultaneously, but the pattern of their approach was dictated by energy efficiency rather than tactical considerations. They ignored potential ambush points, ignored defensive installations that appeared offline, ignored everything except the promise of abundant resources waiting to be consumed. "They're taking the bait," Captain Zergoth breathed. The first Devourer vessels reached the platform's outer hull and began the feeding process. Beams of energy that could slice through any known material started carving into the installation's structure, but the cuts followed predictable patterns based on energy density mapping. They were feeding, not fighting, and feeding behavior could be predicted. "Technological infection is uploading," Commander Vixine reported. "The resource management systems are being accessed exactly as predicted. Estimate 37 minutes until full network integration. 37 minutes until they would know whether 5 years of being ignored had taught her something that the Coalition's greatest military minds had missed, or whether her arrogance had just doomed every living being in the galaxy." Admiral Lieutenant Morquette said quietly, "What happens if this doesn't work?" Zara watched the Devourers systematically consuming the platform around them, their movements as predictable as any other biological process. Somewhere in the depths of space, Admiral Thekvar's fleet was waiting for her signal. Across dozens of star systems, Coalition forces were preparing for the largest military engagement in galactic history. All of it depended on her being right about what the Devourers actually were. "If this doesn't work," she said, "then the Coalition learns a valuable lesson about the dangers of underestimating anyone, even humans." But as she watched the infection spread through the Devourer network with the mathematical precision she had predicted, as she saw their feeding behavior follow exactly the patterns her models had projected, Zara felt something she hadn't experienced since joining the Coalition Defense Force. She felt like she was finally visible, and the Devourers were about to discover what it meant to be hunted by something they had never learned to fear. The infection had been spreading through the Devourer network for 18 hours when Admiral Zara Chen received the transmission that changed everything. She stood in the emergency command center aboard the Coalition flagship Infinite Resolve, surrounded by holographic displays showing the positions of over 3,000 ships, the largest military force in galactic history. But the expression on Supreme Admiral Kex Thrall's reptilian features suggested that their greatest weapon might have just become their greatest problem. "Admiral Chen," Kex Thrall's voice carried a gravity that made everyone on the bridge fall silent. "We have received confirmation from the Outer Rim monitoring stations. The technological infection has not only integrated with the Devourer network, it has accelerated their consumption rate by 43%. The words hit Zara like a physical blow. Around her, the assembled officers exchanged glances that ranged from confusion to barely contained panic. Admiral Thekvar's crystalline body resonated with harmonics that translated roughly to, "I told you this was insane," while General Mordun's scarred armor plates rattled as he shifted his massive weight. "That's impossible," Zara said, but even as the words left her mouth, she was pulling up the latest sensor data. The numbers were undeniable. Instead of creating the subtle systemic dysfunction she had designed, her carefully crafted technological virus had somehow optimized the Devourer's feeding efficiency. 17 star systems have been completely consumed in the past 18 hours, Kexthrall continued. At their current rate of acceleration, they will reach the core worlds in less than 48 hours. Admiral Chen, what exactly did you do to them? Zara stared at the tactical displays, her mind racing through possibilities that all led to the same terrifying conclusion. The infection hadn't failed. It had succeeded too well, but not in the way she had intended. I need to see the behavioral analysis data from the affected systems, she said, her voice steady despite the growing certainty that she had just made the deadliest mistake in military history. All of it. Every feeding sequence, every movement pattern, every… Admiral Thekvar interrupted, his harmonic resonance now carrying overtones of pure terror. Perhaps this is not the time for analysis. The bridge fell silent except for the soft humming of the ship's systems. Through the massive viewports, Zara could see the lights of the Coalition fleet stretching to the horizon, thousands of ships representing the combined military might of 12 species. It should have been an inspiring sight. Instead, it looked like a funeral procession. "Show me the data," she repeated quietly. Commander Vixine manipulated her controls with frantic efficiency, her bioluminescent patterns cycling through colors that had no translation in any known language. The main display activated, showing recordings from the most recent Devourer attacks. What Zara saw made her blood turn cold. The swarm was moving with unprecedented coordination. Where before their attacks had followed predictable patterns based on energy optimization, now they demonstrated something that looked disturbingly like strategic planning. They were hitting multiple targets simultaneously, coordinating their movements across vast distances and adapting their tactics in real time. But it was the feeding sequences that revealed the true horror of what she had done. "They're not just consuming resources anymore," she whispered, watching biomechanical vessels strip entire installations down to their component atoms with terrifying efficiency. "They're learning. The infection isn't disrupting their systems. It's teaching them how to optimize their consumption algorithms." Dr. Bate, Hemlock's mandibles clicked frantically as he processed the implications. "But that should be impossible. Your technological virus was designed to create inefficiencies, not enhance their capabilities. Unless," Zara said, the realization hitting her like a plasma cannon blast, the Devourers aren't just sophisticated biological machines. Unless they're sophisticated biological machines with the capacity for technological integration. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft alarm tones indicating incoming priority transmissions from across the galaxy. Reports of accelerated Devourer attacks, of star systems falling faster than anyone had thought possible. Admiral Chen, Supreme Admiral Kexthrall's voice carried the weight of someone who was watching his entire civilization collapse in real time. "I need to know exactly what we're dealing with. If the Devourers have become more dangerous because of your infection, then we need to adapt our strategy immediately." Zara closed her eyes, forcing herself to think past the panic and self-recrimination. She had made a fundamental error in her analysis, but dwelling on that error wouldn't save the billions of lives that were now at risk. She needed to understand what had gone wrong, and more importantly, how to fix it. The infection was designed to modify their resource management protocols, she said, opening her eyes and focusing on the data streaming across the displays. "But I based those modifications on the assumption that they were purely biological entities, using advanced technology. What if they're actually hybrid biotechnological entities?" Dr. Hemlock's massive frame shifted as he leaned forward. "Are you suggesting that the Devourers themselves are partially technological? That they've integrated artificial intelligence into their biological matrix?" "I'm suggesting something worse," Zara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm suggesting that they're evolving, and we just taught them how to evolve faster." The tactical display updated with new information from the monitoring stations showing the current position and projected course of the Devourer swarm. The formation had changed dramatically from their previous attacks. Instead of the organic flowing patterns that had characterized their movements for years, they now moved in geometric formations that maximized both feeding efficiency and defensive coordination. They're not just consuming our technology, she continued, her mind racing through the implications. They're analyzing it, understanding it, integrating it into their own systems. The infection didn't disrupt their network. It gave them access to our technological knowledge base. Admiral Thekvar's harmonic resonance reached frequencies that most organic beings found physically painful. You're saying that we've accidentally upgraded our enemies? Worse than that, Zara said, manipulating the display to show comparative analysis between pre-infection and post-infection devourer behavior. We've given them the ability to understand us. They're not following biological imperatives anymore. They're making strategic decisions based on technological analysis of our capabilities and weaknesses. The implications of that statement rippled through the bridge like a shockwave. Every officer present understood what it meant. The devourers were no longer the sophisticated but predictable biological machines they had been fighting for years. They had become something new, a hybrid intelligence that combined the relentless efficiency of biological evolution with the adaptive capabilities of advanced artificial intelligence. "Admiral," General Morden said, his gravelly voice carrying the tone of someone who was rapidly calculating odds of survival, "if your analysis is correct, then our current tactical plan is not merely inadequate, it's suicidal. We've positioned our entire fleet based on predictions of their previous behavior patterns, which they no longer follow," Zara confirmed. "They know we're here. They know what we're planning. And they're adapting their strategy accordingly." As if summoned by her words, alerts began cascading across the tactical displays. Long-range sensors were detecting massive changes in the Devourer swarm's movement patterns. Instead of following the carefully prepared route that should have led them into the Coalition's trap, they were dispersing across dozens of different vectors, approaching the core worlds from multiple directions simultaneously. "They're not taking the bait anymore," Commander Vixen reported, her bioluminescent patterns now cycling through what could only be described as barely controlled hysteria. "They're avoiding every system we've prepared, every defensive position we've established. It's like they know exactly where our forces are positioned." "Because they do know," Zara said quietly. "The technological integration works both ways. If they've absorbed our resource management protocols, they've also absorbed our tactical databases. They know our fleet positions, our defensive capabilities, our communication frequencies, everything." Supreme Admiral Kexthal stood slowly, his ancient frame casting shadows across the entire bridge. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had commanded fleets for centuries, but also the exhaustion of someone who was watching everything he had fought to protect slip away. "Admiral Chen," he said, "I need a solution, not an analysis of how we reached this point, but a concrete plan for preventing the extinction of our civilization. You created this problem. Can you solve it?" The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Every eye on the bridge was focused on her, waiting for the human who had promised to save them all to somehow find a way out of the catastrophe she had created. The weight of their expectations, combined with the crushing responsibility for billions of lives, should have been paralyzing. Instead, Zara felt something she hadn't experienced since her promotion: clarity. "Yes," she said, her voice gaining strength as the solution began to form in her mind. "But not the way you think. We can't fight them anymore. They know too much about us now. But there's something they don't know, something they can't know, because it's not in any of our databases or tactical manuals." "What?" Kexthal demanded. Zara turned to face the assembled officers, and for the first time since the crisis began, she smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the smile of someone who had just realized that their greatest mistake might also be their salvation. "They know how we think when we're trying to be civilized," she said. "They've absorbed our military doctrines, our technological protocols. our strategic planning methodologies. They understand everything about how the coalition fights wars." She paused, letting that sink in before delivering the conclusion that would either save them all or doom them forever. "But they have no idea what humans are like when we stop pretending to be civilized. They've never seen us hunt." The silence that followed was different from the earlier confusion and panic. This was the silence of beings who were beginning to understand that their salvation might lie not in their greatest strengths, but in embracing something far more primal. "What are you proposing?" Kex Thrall asked. "I'm proposing that we give them exactly what they don't expect," Zara said. "I'm proposing that we stop fighting like the Coalition Defense Force and start hunting like the apex predators that humans actually are." She gestured to the tactical display, but instead of showing fleet positions and defensive installations, she began highlighting something else entirely. The deep space monitoring stations, the communication relays, the supply depots that formed the invisible infrastructure of galactic civilization. "They think they understand us because they've absorbed our technology," she continued. "But technology isn't what made humans the dominant species on Earth. What made us dominant was our willingness to destroy everything, including ourselves, rather than accept defeat." The officers around her exchanged glances that mixed confusion with the dawning realization that they were about to witness something that no civilized species had ever seen: humanity without the restraints of civilization. "Admiral Chen," Admiral Thekvar said carefully, "what exactly are you suggesting?" Zara's smile became something that would have been recognizable to any predator that had ever stalked prey across the African savanna. "I'm suggesting that we burn down the galaxy," she said, "and make the Devourers choke on the ashes." For the first time since joining the Coalition Defense Force, Admiral Zara Chen was about to show them what humans were truly capable of when they stopped trying to fit into someone else's definition of civilized warfare. The hunt was about to begin in earnest. The Scorched Earth Protocol had never been more than a theoretical contingency plan, filed away in the deepest archives of Coalition Command and forgotten by everyone except the humans who had proposed it. Now, as Admiral Zara Chen stood before the emergency session of the Coalition High Command, she was asking them to implement a strategy so extreme that it had been rejected as too barbaric for civilized warfare. "You want to destroy our own infrastructure," Admiral Thekvar said, his crystalline body resonating with frequencies that translated roughly to horrified disbelief. "You want us to systematically demolish communication networks, supply depots, refueling stations, and orbital installations across 17 star systems. Not just destroy them," Zara corrected, manipulating the holographic display to show the scope of her proposal. "Contaminate them. Every destroyed installation will be seeded with quantum-level disruptors that will corrupt any technology that attempts to integrate with the debris field. The Devourers won't just be denied resources, they'll be poisoned by them." Supreme Admiral Kex Thrall studied the tactical projections with the intensity of someone who understood that the next words he spoke would either save galactic civilization or condemn it to extinction. Around the chamber, representatives from all 12 coalition species sat in stunned silence, processing the implications of what the human admiral was proposing. "The economic cost would be catastrophic," General Mordoon stated, his scarred armor plates rattling as he gestured to the resource projections. "We would be deliberately destroying infrastructure that took centuries to build. Entire sectors would be cut off from galactic civilization for decades." "Better cut off than consumed," Zara replied, "and the economic cost is irrelevant if we're all dead." "Doctor." Hemlock's mandibles clicked in what might have been thoughtful consideration or barely controlled anxiety. "Admiral Chen, your plan requires precise timing across multiple star systems. If even one installation fails to detonate at the proper moment, the Devourers could adapt and develop countermeasures. Which is why we're not going to give them time to adapt," Zara said. She manipulated the display again, showing a cascade pattern that would ripple across the galaxy like a wave of controlled destruction. "We destroy everything simultaneously across all 17 systems in a coordinated strike that will take less than 4 minutes to complete." 4 minutes to demolish the infrastructure of 17 star systems. Admiral Thekvar repeated, his harmonics now carrying overtones of something that might have been admiration or terror. Even if it's possible, the coordination required would be unprecedented. Humans specialized in unprecedented coordination for most of our evolutionary history, Zara said. We hunted creatures that were faster, stronger, and better armed than we were. We survived because we learned to work together in ways that our prey couldn't predict or counter. She gestured to the assembled officers, most of whom were still staring at her projections, like she had just suggested they commit mass suicide. Every species in the coalition approaches warfare from the perspective of preserving their own advantages. You fight to maintain your territories, protect your resources, preserve your technological capabilities. It's logical, it's civilized. It's exactly what the Devourers expect. The chamber fell silent except for the soft humming of the holographic projectors. Through the massive viewports, the lights of the Coalition fleet stretched across space like a constellation of hope. But Zara could see in the faces around her that hope was rapidly giving way to desperation. But humans, she continued, evolved on a planet where the logical response was often species suicide, where the only way to survive was to be willing to lose everything rather than accept defeat. We learned to burn our own hunting grounds rather than let our enemies use them against us. Supreme Admiral Kex Thrall leaned forward, his ancient eyes reflecting a wisdom earned through centuries of command decisions. You're asking us to trust in something that goes against every military principle we've ever developed. You want us to voluntarily weaken ourselves in the hope that our enemies will be weakened more. Not hope, Zara said firmly. Certainty. The Devourers have evolved to be the perfect parasites. They consume everything and waste nothing. But parasites have a fundamental weakness. They depend completely on their hosts. Eliminate the host and the parasite dies. She manipulated the display one final time, showing the projected aftermath of the Scorched Earth Protocol. System after system would become a wasteland of poison debris, useless to the Devourers but serving as a barrier that would funnel them toward a single destination, a destination where the Coalition's remaining forces would be waiting with weapons specifically designed to exploit the technological vulnerabilities they had accidentally created. The infection taught them how to integrate our technology, she explained, but it also made them dependent on that integration. They've become addicted to technological enhancement. The quantum disruptors will trigger cascade failures in any biotechnological system that attempts to process the contaminated debris. Instead of making them stronger, consuming our destroyed infrastructure will systematically poison their entire network. Dr. Hemlock's massive frame shifted as understanding dawned. You're turning their greatest advantage into their greatest weakness. Their hunger will become a compulsion to consume materials that will destroy them from within. Exactly, Zara said. And once their network begins failing, once the integration systems that allow them to coordinate become corrupted, they'll revert to their original biological programming. They'll become predictable again. General Morden stood slowly, his natural armor creaking with the sound of metal under stress. Admiral Chen, assuming your strategy works, assuming we can successfully poison their network and force them back to biological behavior patterns, what then? We'll have a weakened but still massive swarm of creatures that can consume planets. How do we finish them? For the first time since presenting her plan, Zara smiled with something that wasn't grim determination. It was the smile of someone who had finally reached the end of a very long hunt. Then we do what humans have always done when we've wounded our prey, she said. We follow them until they bleed out. The next 18 hours were the most intense in the Coalition's 3,000-year history. Across 17 star systems, demolition teams worked frantically to prepare installations for synchronized destruction. Every communication relay, every supply depot, every orbital platform that could provide resources to the Devourer swarm was rigged with explosives and quantum disruptors. Ships that had served faithfully for decades were loaded with poisoned cargo and set on collision courses with strategic targets. Zara stood in the command center aboard the Infinite Resolve, watching as reports filtered in from across the galaxy. The scale of deliberate destruction was staggering. The Coalition was voluntarily dismantling the infrastructure that had taken millennia to construct. But as each installation reported ready status, she felt something she hadn't experienced since the crisis began: genuine hope. Admiral Commander Vixine reported, her bioluminescent patterns cycling through colors that indicated barely controlled excitement. All systems report ready for synchronized detonation. The Devoury Vanguard has reached the outer perimeter of the target zone. The tactical display showed the enemy swarm approaching the prepared systems with the same methodical efficiency that had characterized their movements for years. They had no reason to suspect a trap. The installations appeared to have been hastily abandoned, exactly the sort of easy feeding opportunity they had come to expect from Coalition forces. Devourer advance units are beginning feeding operations, Lieutenant Morkeep. Energy signatures indicate they're attempting to integrate with our technological systems as predicted. Zara watched the enemy vessels begin their consumption pattern, following behavioral algorithms that she now understood had been enhanced by her own technological virus. They moved with terrifying coordination, stripping installations down to their component atoms with efficiency that bordered on the miraculous. But that efficiency was about to become their downfall. All systems stand by, she announced over the fleet-wide communication channel. Synchronized detonation in 60 seconds. Across 17 star systems, thousands of Coalition personnel held their breath as the countdown began. Installations that had protected civilized space for centuries prepared to die in service to a strategy so desperate that it had never been seriously considered before a human proposed it. 30 seconds, Zara announced. The Devourer vessels continued their feeding, unaware that every atom of material they consumed was about to become a weapon turned against them. Their biotechnological systems processed the absorbed resources, integrated them into their network. 10 seconds. Zara thought about the 5 years she had spent invisible, ignored, treated like an irrelevant pet by beings who should have known better. She thought about the countless times she had been passed over for promotion, dismissed from strategic discussions, excluded from the inner circles where real decisions were made. 5 seconds. She thought about the moment when Supreme Admiral Kexthral had finally looked at her and seen something worth listening to. The moment when a lifetime of being underestimated had finally become the foundation for saving galactic civilization. Execute. Across 17 star systems, the galaxy burned. The synchronized destruction was beautiful and terrible to witness. Installations that had stood for millennia vanished in cascades of fire that could be seen from dozens of light years away. Communication networks that had connected thousands of worlds went silent in a single instant. The infrastructure of galactic civilization died in a coordinated symphony of controlled demolition. And within the heart of the Devourer's swarm, cascade failures began. The quantum disruptors did exactly what Zara had predicted. As the enemy vessels attempted to process the contaminated debris, their biotechnological integration systems began to collapse. DOMATFORAN. Ship after ship succumbed to systemic failures that spread through their network like a technological plague. The enhanced coordination that had made them so dangerous dissolved into chaos as their hybrid intelligence reverted to pure biological imperatives. "Admiral!" Commander Vixine shouted, her patterns now blazing with colors that had no translation in any language. "Enemy coordination is breaking down!" They're reverting to individual unit behavior patterns. The tactical display showed the Devourer swarm fragmenting as their technological enhancements failed. Where before they had moved with the precision of a single organism, now they began exhibiting the chaotic behavior of creatures whose instincts no longer matched their capabilities. Some vessels continued their feeding operations despite obvious system failures. Others fled randomly into deep space. Still others turned on their own kind, their corrupted integration systems identifying nearby vessels as threats to be eliminated. Phase 2, all units, Zara ordered. Begin pursuit operations. Target the fleeing vessels first. Don't let any of them escape to warn others of their kind. The Coalition fleet, held in reserve throughout the destruction phase, now swept down upon the confused and weakened enemy like an avalanche. Ships that had been struggling to defeat even small groups of devourers now found themselves facing creatures that could barely coordinate their own defensive systems. It wasn't a battle, it was an extermination. But more importantly, it was a hunt. For the next 72 hours, Coalition forces pursued fleeing devourer vessels across dozens of systems. Every ship that tried to escape was tracked down and destroyed. Every attempt at regrouping was shattered before it could gain momentum. The creatures that had once been unstoppable were now nothing more than wounded prey fleeing before predators they finally understood they could not defeat. Zara stood in the command center watching the tactical displays show the systematic elimination of the greatest threat the galaxy had ever faced. But her attention wasn't focused on the victory itself. It was focused on the faces of the alien officers around her. They were looking at her differently now. Not with the casual dismissal that had characterized her entire military career, but with something that might have been fear mixed with respect. They had finally seen what humans were capable of when they stopped trying to fit into someone else's definition of civilization. "Admiral Chen," Supreme Admiral Kex Thrall said quietly, approaching her position near the central display. "The threat appears to be neutralized. Your strategy has succeeded beyond our most optimistic projections." Zara nodded, but didn't take her eyes off the displays. "It's not finished yet, Supreme Admiral. We've broken their coordination and scattered the survivors, but there are still thousands of individual vessels out there. It will take months to track them all down. But they're no longer coordinated. They're no longer a strategic threat to Coalition space." "No," she agreed. "They're just prey now." Kex Thrall studied her profile with ancient eyes that had seen the rise and fall of civilizations. "Admiral, I must ask, did you know this would work? Were you certain that the Scorched Earth Protocol would succeed?" Zara turned to face him, and for a moment he could see behind the controlled exterior to the exhaustion and relief of someone who had just gambled the fate of galactic civilization on a strategy that had never been tested outside of theoretical models. "No," she said honestly, "I wasn't certain of anything except that conventional tactics would fail. But, Supreme Admiral, there's something you need to understand about humans. We didn't survive our evolution by being certain. We survived by being willing to try things that no rational species would attempt." She gestured to the tactical displays showing the ongoing pursuit operations. "Every other species in the Coalition approaches problems by building on their strengths. Humans approach problems by eliminating every option except victory. Sometimes that means being willing to destroy everything rather than accept defeat." Kex Thrall was silent for a long moment, processing implications that went far beyond the current crisis. "Admiral Chen, your species has served in Coalition forces for 5 years. During that time, you have been consistently underestimated and underutilized. After what I have witnessed today, I must ask, have we been making a fundamental error in our assessment of human capabilities?" Zara looked around the command center at the alien officers who had spent years treating her like an irrelevant curiosity. Officers who now watched her with the wariness reserved for something that might be far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. "With respect, Supreme Admiral," she said, "you've been making a fundamental error in your assessment of what humans actually are. You thought we were a civilized species that happened to be primitive. You never considered that we might be an apex predator species that learned how to fake being civilized." The silence that followed her words was profound. Around the bridge, conversation stopped as the implications of that statement sank in. The humans weren't the weakest member of the Coalition. They were the most dangerous. They had simply been pretending to be harmless because it was easier than explaining what they were truly capable of. "And now?" Kex Thrall asked quietly. Zara smiled, but there was no warmth in it. It was the smile of someone who no longer needed to hide what they were. "Now you know," she said, "and the galaxy is going to have to decide what to do with that knowledge." As the pursuit operations continued and the last remnants of the Devourer threat were systematically eliminated, word of the Coalition's victory spread across inhabited space. But along with news of the victory came something else, the realization that the small, fragile humans who had been treated as pets and curiosities were actually the most ruthlessly effective predators the galaxy had ever seen. Admiral Zara Chen was no longer invisible. She was no longer underestimated. She was no longer treated like a harmless pet playing at being a soldier. For the first time in her life, she was seen for exactly what she was, a human being who had finally stopped pretending to be anything else. And the galaxy would never make the mistake of underestimating humanity again. The Hunt.